So in programming, and as I'm sure a lot of you have seen it, you can get exceptions all the time, basically errors, right? But not really errors. Errors are a separate thing, but for this purpose, let's call them errors until we learn what the difference is. So for example, when I read this in, right, I'm reading in a 0, a 1, or a 2, then I do input.nextInt, right? I want to read in the next int. Well, what if the user doesn't type in an int? What would happen if I typed in Apple, right? The program is looking for a 0, a 1, or a 2, but the user types in an Apple, and this is just stuff that users do. They'll find a way to break your program. If I type in Apple, I'm like 100% certain I'll get an error. I'll get an exception. Exception in main thread, java.util.input mismatch exception. If I click here, assignment 7, Java 31, it tells me what line is this line. Basically, I'm trying to read in an integer, but the user typed in a string, right? Again, if I type in a 2 and I mistakenly add an exclamation point, a quotation mark to it, I'm going to get an error again. This quotation mark is not an integer. I'll get input mismatch exception again, right? That's because my program is looking for an integer, but I read in a string. And there are many different scenarios that can occur that could cause an exception. And it's on you as the programmer to account for those. Or your program would crash, and you see my program has crashed, and it won't run anymore. And we all know how annoying it is when a program crashes. Sometimes it's just programmer, carelessness, or programmer didn't realize that an exception could occur based on how we use their program. And trust me, if your program doesn't account for the exceptions, there is one user in some remote location that will hit that exception and break your program. All right, so it is important to catch these exceptions, to think about, okay, how can an error occur? All right, so let's talk about exceptions. It's a problem that arises during the execution of a program. It could also arise before you start your program. When an exception occurs, and as we saw, it disrupts the flow of your program, and it would make it stop. Right? My program stopped because I didn't handle it. So it's on us as programmers to handle that exception. All right, so what are some of the reasons that an exception can occur? Like I just did, the user entered an invalid data, right? We're looking for an integer, but they entered in a string. Or say next class, actually, we'll talk about how to read from files. So say we have a file that wants to be read, we pass in the location of that file, but it doesn't exist. There is no file there. Your program will run into an exception. Or say you're trying to communicate with a web server. In Java, you can build something called a socket that communicates with web servers. And let's say the communication is lost midway through and an exception occurs. Or you run out of memory. There could be, you're trying to access an index in an array that doesn't exist, and it would have an index out of bounds exception. So there are a lot of different reasons for exceptions, and there are a lot of different types of exceptions. So I just want to give you the main types of exceptions. So one thing, you have errors. Errors, it's hard to account for. They occur, and then you just have to figure out, okay, how do I avoid those errors? Exceptions, on the other hand, is something that we can actually control, and we can account for them in our programming. So checked exceptions are ones that are checked by the compiler when you try to compile a program, okay? They cannot be ignored. You must handle them, or you can't compile your program. So what we'll talk about next time is reading from a file. So let's say we want to read from a file, and I'm just going to write it down here because I want to use this code later. Let's say we want to read from a file. So let's create file equals new file, and then location to file. So this is how you would create a file, right? And then we have to import file. What did I just press? I don't like this. I don't know what I pressed, but now my my code is full screen. So this is how you create a file right here. Basically, in programming, this is how you create the object to point to a file. To read from it, we would say scanner file, doesn't matter what we name it, scanner equals new scanner, and we pass in the file. And you see here, before I go any further, it's saying unreported exception, file not found exception. So before I go any further, I have to handle this exception. So there's a couple different ways. I like tries and catches, which we'll talk about in a second. And you see basically try to do this, catch file not found exception, and then it prints it out to the console. But again, that's a checked exception. Before I go any further, the compiler tells me I need to handle this exception. All right. Whereas with this one up here, remember, this doesn't show an error before I compile it. There's no error. That's called an unchecked exception or a runtime exception because it occurs at runtime. So let me delete this down here. The unchecked exception occurs at runtime. Right now, I can run my program. There is no issue. Let's see, window. I don't know why everything went away, but I don't know how to get everything back. But anyway, I can run my program no problem if I can figure out how to run it. There we go. Run. And of course, every time in the middle of class is when it wants to do crazy stuff. Let's see. And I don't have no idea how to get everything back. Hold on a second while I try to get everything back. There we go. Cool. All right. Let me stop this. Let me try to run this again. Here we go. All right. So this is an unchecked exception right here. It works at compile time. I can compile my program, but if I type in something, it's going to result in an exception and break my program. That's an unchecked exception, okay? That's the main difference between a checked and unchecked. A checked one occurs before you can't go any further until you handle it. An unchecked one, it occurs at runtime. All right. And then you have errors. So again, errors aren't really exceptions. They're just problems that could occur. So for example, when we create our programs, the operating system allocates a certain amount of memory for our program. And let's say our program, just because we are creating a very intensive program, it goes beyond the bounds of that memory allocation. You would get an error, and that's something that you really can't account for. You just have to modify your program to be more efficient with the memory it has. All right, so how do we handle those exceptions that we run into? Well, there's something called a try-catch, right? So a try, it tries to do something, and then it catches an exception, right? Everything within the try-catch block is referred to as protected code, okay? So here's the syntax for a try-catch. We try the protected code, and then we catch the exception that could occur. And then inside our catch block, we do something, all right? So for example, in this right here, I know that an exception can occur. So what I can do is surround it with a try. So try to do this, right? And then catch input mismatch exception. I'm going to say EX, you got to name something. System.out.println EX dot, I think I got to import this. Yeah, I got to import it. Import EX dot toString, right? And that gets the toString or whatever that exception is. Right? Now you see that I got a couple of issues. One, option was declared inside of a try. So if this try is failed, I'll never get down here. So what I want to do is take all of this and put it inside my try as well. I only want to do all of that if this exception is not hit. So if the user enters in the correct input, do all of this stuff. If the user enters in an apple, print it out, and then try to repeat it. So what you'll see is now that I'm catching that exception, it won't stop my program. Our program will print out the exception. So if I type in an apple, it'll print out the exception, but then it'll keep going. And it won't read a new one. But basically, it's going to keep going and over again into an infinite loop, it looks like. So let's see, why is there an infinite loop? So we try this, then we catch it. So why is it going into this catch over and over again? And here's where debugging comes in handy, because at this point I would need to debug this program and see why is it repeating this over and over again. I want to read in a new input. Yeah, I would just have to debug this and see why it's doing it. But basically, I caught it, and now you can see my program is not doing what I wanted to do, but it is still running, right? It is running over and over again. It should be catching this exception and then reading in a new input, but for some reason it doesn't want to do that. So if I type in a 0, everything should work as expected. I stop this. If I type in something that's not an integer, so again, if I type in a v-ball, yeah, it catches the exception, but for some reason it's running it infinitely. I would just have to debug that and see why. But that's why you use an exception, is to catch those. So you use a try catch for that. Let's say we have a pretty complex amount of code, and it can throw off a whole bunch of different exceptions. So let's say I'm reading from a file, and then I'm reading from the console. Or let's say I'm reading from the console the file name. There are a couple of different exceptions that could occur. So I could try to do all of that and catch multiple exceptions, right? Catch all those different exceptions that could occur. And then with try catches, there is something called a finally clause. Finally, it runs it regardless. So it runs it regardless if the exception was true. Finally, system.out.println, this is run regardless, and I want to break. So the finally clause is run regardless. So if I enter an apple, it's going to go into this is run regardless. The finally clause runs regardless. If I enter in a tennis player, Serena, let's see, 69, 250, 10, WTA, it's going to go down to this is run regardless. That finally clause is always hit regardless, right? And right here is saying to, when I do this break statement, it disregards the finally clause. Like, what's the point of having the break if you have a finally? But I want to do it for this example. All right. So again, finally clause is really good if you want to try something, and if it doesn't work, you want to clean it up, right? Finally clauses are really good for cleanup behaviors. And here's the syntax, and I just went over that. You would have your try, catch all your different exceptions, and then finally. All right. Any questions about exceptions, handled or checked, unchecked exceptions, and how to handle them?